Breaking It Down with Frank MacKay. This is 103.9 LI News Radio.
I'd like to welcome everyone to Breaking It Down. This is Frank MacKay, but more importantly, our very special guest today is a wonderful author of a fantastic book, chilling book, The Children's War, Germany 1939 to 1949. Peter Gawenda is our very special guest. Peter, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good, and it's a pleasure to speak to someone who's survived something like that. But in reading about you and in hearing about you, in my mind, it would be the most frightening experience in the world. In your mind as a child, did you look at it as an adventure?
Yes, we children, when I say children, it was my older brother and I, and later my also one of my younger brothers and I, and my older brother, we looked at it as an adventure because that was the way our grandparents and especially the two grandfathers and my mother made it look like. They did not want us to develop any type of fear or aversion because they knew that the war would take a long time, the Second World War. And so they wanted to make sure that we would survive it and not have any type of backlash later on.
I think it was very wise of your family to treat it that way. I just read, I can't help but get teary-eyed thinking of you as a 3.5-year-old dropping off your father to go off to war for the first time, and you're watching your mother cry, and your dad join other men going on trucks to go off to war. Do you have that memory in your mind, or is that been played back to you?
No, it's strange. There are certain things that I do vividly remember. And in fact, I went back to my hometown, to my birthplace, about 2 years ago, and we went to that spot where the trucks left to that station, and everything I could actually recall. It was very strange. And I did not recall it as something bad. It was just something that fit into how my grandparents and how my mother brought us up.
Maybe it was the idea that they didn't make it sound tragic or didn't make it seem tragic. Maybe that kind of opened up your mind rather than close it down. You know, some people suppress childhood memories that are frightening or that are terrifying. You know, maybe the fact that your mom taught you to not be afraid of this. Maybe that's why you have such a strong memory. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yes, that's correct. We talked about that many years later, especially when my dad returned from Russian prison, because he recognized also that we children seemed to be very open-minded to what had happened, and we actually accepted, and that was something that my mother's side always instilled on us. The Germans started the war, and so we had to accept it as something, whatever happened, that it was not because the others started. No, it was the Germans who started. And I think
that. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
And I think that really sank in. And even today, if when I give speeches or when I teach, I make it a very strong point. The Germans started it. And there might have been one German that is always being mentioned, but many, many Germans supported him, and so it was the Germans.
Yeah, that's a departure from how many people view their own situations, and so often there's a rationalization that comes in society, into society, especially to the children. They say, well, we're doing this for our country, we're doing this for our nation, everything else. The fact that your parents, the fact that your folks, your family, your grandfather, everyone told you the truth from the start. It's just an amazing approach. Did you find that the other children that were your peers, your classmates, your friends in the neighborhood, were they being taught the same reality as you are?
No.
Go ahead.
No, not really, and that's why, especially in school, we were quite often attacked, not only by the children, but also by our teachers. Even after the war, when we insisted on, and we had the background, we had the knowledge, we were told what had happened. And so we were always very, how should I call it, very well informed. In fact, I did the same thing then to my children. And as an example, when my son went to college here in the U.S., he got in trouble because he was very clear what had happened and how it had happened.
If you're just joining us or if you're just turning on your radio, this is Frank MacKay, but more importantly, author Peter Gawenda is our very special guest. Professor Peter Gawenda is the author of the wonderful book, The Children's War, Germany, 1939 to 1949. I'm sure a lot of people, when they see that title, they wonder if that's a typo, 1949. Why did you choose that decade of time?
Yeah, we chose 1949. I chose 1949 because that's when my father returned from Siberia. And for the longest time, we didn't even know whether he was alive or not. And only maybe a year before he returned, we had indications that he was in prison in Siberia. And so for us children, that was the end of the war. Dad came home, and we were a full family again. And so that's why I chose 49.
It's my understanding that you were always a close-knit family, and I guess your dad was the final piece of that puzzle. During that time, did it feel like something was missing, or did your other family members compensate?
There was always something missing, and my parents made it a point. Well, not my parents, my mother and my grandparents made it a point that even like on Sunday dinner or lunch, there was always an extra plate that would have been for my dad. And so they wanted to make sure that we were brought up and that we were taught that we're a family with a father who happened to be first in Poland, then in France, and in Russia. And so although quite often we didn't even know where he was, and for example, my mother's side, who was an elementary school teacher, she made us write to our dad what all was going on, but then the letters came back because they didn't find him. And so that's maybe also why I have quite an amount of detailed knowledge of what had happened at that time.
Your grandfather was an air warden?
Yes, correct. The father of my mother was an air raid warden.
And what does that entail? That was it for your neighborhood? Was it for a district?
That was a small town, and whenever he had telephone connections to, I don't know what the central area was. Whenever there was an attack coming, like air raid the Allied Air Forces coming in, whether they were British, American, or Russian, then he would make sure that the sirens would be started so that everybody was able to go into the air raid shelters.
Did it seem a little more comforting that your grandfather was in charge of that? Did it give you the feeling? Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, it was. I have to admit, we always felt like he was one of our heroes because he knew what the war was doing, what was happening during the war. And I have to admit, and also our neighbors, and then there was an aunt and her children, and the cousins, 2 male cousins, 1 female cousin. We were all very close-knit, and we knew that it was our grandfather who was warning everybody.
Yeah, I mean that must have felt empowering, if not safe, almost like if a child had a police officer as a grandfather, or.
Very, very true. And he was actually an officer in the First World War, a low-ranking officer, and so he was a very, very proud Prussian, and he was not very much pro-National Socialism. In fact, when he was already 80 when he was then drafted again and back into the war, into the Second World War. And so, but he was very, very clear in safeguarding us and in making sure that we would not start hating or that we would not be anti-American or anti-British or anti-Russian, because he felt that we were a global family, and it was not our fault and it was not their fault, those that came and dropped the bombs, because, as I said before, he believed very strongly and made us understand the Germans started the war. And he was very clear, by the way, on explaining to us also what had happened during the First World War, because he was in the First World War, and he was, for example, in Turkey for a while, training Turks, and so he had the idea, not only the idea, he had the conviction that the National Socialism was the wrong thing that happened to Germany, and that's maybe why he was also somehow prosecuted, although he safeguarded us and he safeguarded the little town that we lived in.
Did he say the Germans started the war, or did he ever specifically say Hitler started the war? Was Hitler used, openly in your house? Critical words of Hitler.
Yes, it was, but what he always said was never to disclose what was said at home. In fact, we spoke several languages at that time, and in German, I'm translating it now. He would always say, "Don't speak Polish, don't speak Yiddish, because that's detrimental to your health." Meaning, he never said that we would end up in concentration camp. It was mentioned at one time, maybe or two times. But he would always point out, don't say the wrong thing. Don't say anything that what we believe in and what my mother and what they believed in, because it would be dangerous to them.
Yeah, well, that's good advice. Did you ever not heed those warnings? Did you and correct me if I'm wrong, you had two brothers and a sister, am I correct?
We were three brothers and one sister, yes.
Did any of you ever not take that advice and speak about it outside of the family?
No, we were trained, had a strong self-discipline, and so we never, during the Second World War, we never used that or never violated his rule. In fact, he and my mother, we had the children's rules that we really followed, because I think he strongly believed, and my mother strongly believed, as long as we followed those rules, we would be safe.
Just an amazing story. And again, if you're just joining us, Peter Gawenda is the voice you're hearing, and he is a voice that has seen a lot in his life at a very young age, younger than any young child should have to see and feel and hear and understand things. But luckily, he had a great family structure that got him through that. Frank MacKay here, but more importantly, author Peter Gawenda is our guest. The Children's War, Germany 1939 to 1949. The 49, if you're joining us late, represents when his father came back from a Russian prison camp in Siberia, which is, just Siberia, the word Siberia, brings up images of dark, cold, constantly, without sunlight. What did you hear about Siberia when your father came home?
My father spoke very little about his time in the prison of war camp, because he was afraid that we might hold that against the Russians, or we might start maybe hating the Russians, although we were not prepared to do that. But he felt, in fact, at that time when he came home, and he did not want to share his experiences. Only later, way later, when I decided to join the German Air Force, that's when he started to talk about it, and then kind of preparing us what might happen if there would be a Third World War, and if we were supposed to be captured, how to behave and how to prevent that we would have to suffer like he did. In fact, my oldest brother joined the Air Force, the Army. I initially was drafted into the Army and then joined the Air Force. And my younger brother, he was in something like the National Guard. And then after the war, there were two more boys, and one of them also joined the Air Force. But my father, we knew that he had suffered quite a bit because we met at one time one of his fellow prisoners that was together with him for quite some time. My dad spoke several languages, Russian, Ukrainian, Mongolian, that he had learned when he was a child because in Gleiwitz, where his home was, my grandfather was a part owner of one of those locomotive factories. And so in that factory, there were so-called white Russians after the First World War that had come to Germany. And so with the children that he played with, I guess he picked up many of those languages. He also spoke Polish, just like a Pole. You would not have known that he was not Polish.
Wow. Just an amazing story. Again, the book, please, everyone, go and get this book. The Children's War, Germany, 1939 through 1949. Wonderful, wonderful author, Peter Gawenda. It's about his childhood, his real childhood as a 3.5-year-old watching his father go off to war. Peter, do you have memories that early of what you wanted to do when you got older? Or is it so clouded by the war? Could you think of anything that wasn't that dark reality that, and again, you saw it as an adventure, but what did you want to do as a young boy?
Naturally, because of my father's father, I was exposed to math, to physics, to engineering, and so I knew that I wanted to go into that type of direction, using math, using physics. But when one of the brothers of my mother, who was a pilot during the Second World War, got killed, then that's when I decided I really would have liked to become a pilot. Although then when I grew up, I knew Germany initially was not accepted by the Allies. And so it didn't look like I would ever be able to become a pilot until then I guess it was in 1956, when the Americans within NATO decided to pick up Germany as one of their allies. But going back as a child, I always felt that I really would like to be a pilot. And naturally, also, we children who were brought up, we need to defend our home, and it needs to become a democracy. And by the way, very early, my grandfather on the mother's side would explain to us what democracy meant. And especially when at one time, when we were in Gleiwitz and Hitler was in one of the parades, my grandfather, even father's side, pointed out that he's the most evil individual that ever lived. And but again, we were told never to talk about it, what we were discussing. And so we just knew that it was bad to be a National Socialist and to be to like Hitler. And I have to admit, we were brought up never to hate, because if you hate, that is a waste of energy. You like something not so much, and then something better, and you really like something very, very much. But and that's why we kind of distance ourselves from anything that was linked to National Socialism or to Hitler. And but that was, I guess, what my grandparents and my mother, and then later on my father, always tried to make us understand. That was the worst time that Germany had gone through and that Germany had caused. And I have to admit also, we lost some of our relatives who happened to be Jewish. And so we knew, we seemed to know what was going on. we seemed to be, it was explained to us. It was a little bit hard to understand, and I remember I did not fully comprehend until 1944, when one of the concentration camps was driven through our town. There were about 2,000 to 3,000 prisoners of one of those concentration camps was brought through our town, and that's when we really understood. And I remember my older brother and I, we were crying because we saw not only grown-ups, but we saw even children walking, and that's when we understood what was going on. And my grandfather, mother's side, my God, was he angry. But they were brought through our town by the SS, and so that's when we also recognized and were told by my grandfather what the SS stood for. And so I have to admit, they are not part of my very much liked groups. Have never been in my life.
I think it's amazing, and what's standing out to me is how heroic your grandparents and your mom and, of course, your dad were in taking this approach, and how enlightened they were for back then. And, usually you think of, again, we're getting a whole different perspective here, but you think of the German people as being so beaten down because of the First World War and the aftermath of that, and to allow a Hitler to come around. So we have this view of the Germans that they didn't care as long as it was better than what it was. But your parents and your grandparents are just heroic folks, Peter. And the book, if you're just tuning in now, is by Peter Gawenda. He's Professor Peter Gawenda, author of The Children's War, Germany, 1939 to 1949. We're going to be hearing a lot more about Peter in the upcoming weeks. Peter, is there a website that you can point people to pick up the book and to follow your career?
Yeah, the website that you would have to go into it's just if you type The Children's War, Germany, 1939-1949, that will show you the different companies, especially Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Marketplace, that have the book for sale. And in fact, most of those have a reduced price on the book. So
terrific. Just terrific. What an honor it is to speak to someone who's been through that. And again, your grandparents and your parents should be always looked at as heroic, and I know you look at them like that as well. Just a tremendous life lesson in a worst period of time. Peter, I want to thank you very much for being here, and again, we look forward to speaking to you in the near future.
Okay.
I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. Frank MacKay here, but more importantly, Peter Gawenda is the author of The Children's War, Germany, 1939 to 1949. It's all about his childhood in war-torn Germany, and it's just an amazing read. Please get the book and stay tuned. We'll be hearing more from Peter in the near future. Frank MacKay signing off. We'll see you next time on Breaking It Down.